Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Like Kapang mentioned, I work for Greenpeace. Right now, I'm working for Greenpeace Southeast Asia as the Regional Research and Investigations Coordinator. And I wanted to talk today focusing on, like Kapang mentioned already, the environmental impacts of our food choices. So I'll go through a few topics that I think are closely related to this. The first one is industrial animal agriculture. The second is palm oil deforestation. The third is industrial fishing. And the fourth is the plastic pandemic and also how that links to our food, because it's become part of our food chain, whether or not we like it. And in order to try not to leave everyone a bit discouraged, I want to try to close off with some solutions and ideas about what we are promoting at Greenpeace and things that we can all do and that we can do as society and that companies can do as well. So I'll jump right into the first topic on industrial animal agriculture. You may or may not know, but there's many reasons why animal agriculture is destroying the environment, and it's something that has to change if we ever want to meet our emissions reduction goals. The first reason I have here is that it is responsible for critical forest destruction. Some of the most important forest areas in the world are being destroyed primarily for animal agriculture. Approximately 80 to 90% of the Amazon is destroyed for animal agriculture, and it's primarily in the form of soy used for feedstock. It's soy that's not really being used for humans. It's being used as feedstock for animals and as well as cattle farming. The second reason why animal agriculture is really bad for the environment is the emissions. And it's not just the emissions from methane that is produced by raising cattle, which you may have heard about, but it's also the emissions from transport, land use change, and use of fresh water. And this is linked to the forest destruction because, of course, forests absorb carbon. So the fact that forests are destroyed to raise animals is not only reducing or emitting carbon, but it's actually reducing our ability to absorb carbon as well. And the third reason I have here is pollution. And actually, cattle farming is the most significant contributor to nitrogen and phosphorus pollution in waterways. So you may not know this, but raising mass farming of animals causes a lot of pollution that is not being currently managed. And another thing that I think is really important here is to look at the size of the problem. So this chart, I think, is really helpful to visualize how inefficient our agricultural system is. You can see the top row is showing the total land on the Earth. Of the total land on the Earth's surface, about 71% is habitable land. That's the orange rectangle in the second line. And then of habitable land, 50% of that is being used for agriculture. And if you go down to the fourth line, of all of the land used for agriculture, 77% is used for meat and dairy livestock, which is a huge amount. Obviously, you can see that the vast majority is being used for animal agriculture, not plant-based agriculture. And this percentage is also including the feed production for animals. So it's the whole chain. So it's also, they're growing soy for feedstock for animals. But the shocking thing is that of that 77%, it's only providing 18% of the world's calories, which you can see is massively inefficient. And it reveals that if we were eating plant-based diets, not only would we require significantly less space, but we could feed many, many more people. We could regrow our forests. We could protect biodiverse areas. So there is a very clear solution here with this broken food system, and we need to be moving towards it. So that's why animal agriculture is so problematic, and it's a bigger problem than I think people realize. They may think, oh, it's just it's not great for the environment, but no agriculture is great for the environment, but actually there's a huge difference between animal agriculture and plant-based agriculture. So you may have also seen something like this. There are a lot of studies showing that have estimated the carbon footprint of different types of foods. And you can see in this chart that 7 out of 10 of the most emissions intensive foods are animal-based, and beef is by far the worst food in terms of carbon emissions. Emissions from beef are more than double the emissions from any other food product. And beef is also linked to dairy because cows are also used for dairy and then sometimes slaughtered for beef. So the beef and dairy industry is very problematic. And now I just want to touch a little bit on some statistics for Malaysia to highlight a bit, because I'm based here, and I found this really interesting, actually, that Malaysians are eating a lot of poultry, so chicken and duck and poultry animals. And I was quite surprised to see that it's not only the most common type of meat in Malaysia, but it's significantly higher than the global average. So in 2015, the global per capita consumption of poultry meat in Malaysia was, the global was 13.8, but in Malaysia it was 49. So that's almost 4 times the global average, which was quite surprising. And another thing that I just wanted to highlight that's specific to Malaysia here, but also is something that's very common in other countries, is that meat is imported, and often meat, dairy, and feedstock is imported. So I found that Malaysia is importing about 80% of its beef from other countries. Almost all dairy products are imported, and Malaysia is in the top poultry importers in the world as well. And of the animals that are raised in Malaysia, about 85% of all animal feed is imported. So even if I think this one is interesting because a lot of people think, oh, maybe eating local is better than eating plant-based. But I think there is a very big difference in the impact here, because even if you're eating local meat, most likely the feedstock for that meat was imported, and you have to remember that it's imported for an animal's entire life. So it's much higher emissions than even importing any other product, any plant-based product. So the emissions from the transportation are actually relatively small in the overall emissions from animal agriculture. And some of the other reasons why this is bad are the fact that it's a food security problem. A lot of countries are really dependent on importing food from other countries, and that also makes them vulnerable when there's a global food crisis or food shock, including price increases. And we've seen this with the war in Ukraine. It has caused a shockwave of inflation on food prices. And when a country is reliant on imports, that's really dangerous and bad for people that struggle to put food on their plate. And it's also, of course, bad to be importing anything because there's emissions from travel. But like I said, those emissions are relatively small from the other emissions that come from raising animals. And one other thing that I think is really important to look at, especially in the current moment about animal agriculture, is the link to infectious disease spread. So there's a number of reasons why infectious diseases spread. But one of them that people may not really think about is the fact that animal agriculture also contributes to that and significantly increases the risk of further disease spreads and things like pandemics. So it was found in a recent study from 2020 that nearly 3/4 of the world's largest meat, fish, and dairy companies were graded as high pandemic risk and criticized for their inability to prevent the emergence of new zoonotic diseases. And this considered a lot of factors. There's a lot of reasons why animal agriculture is contributing to that. It's not just the fact that it's destroying forests and ecosystems, but it's also the living and working conditions in animal farms, which you've probably seen photos. The animals are usually contained in very small spaces. Disease spreads very quickly, and it's the kind of environment that's a lot of antibiotics are used, which leads to antibiotic resistance. And there's just many problems that make animal farming not only vulnerable to pandemics and diseases, but also a potential cause for spreading them around the world. And there's also been clear links between biodiversity loss and the spread of zoonotic diseases. So it's been shown through a number of studies that biodiversity is actually protecting us from disease transmission. For example, by diluting large single species populations, which prevents transmission from mosquitoes. But there's many other ways and other examples of infectious diseases that have increased when biodiversity and forests are destroyed. So by encroaching more on the natural environment, we are reducing our protection against zoonotic diseases. And in addition to that, there's other reasons why we are putting ourselves more at risk, because when we're destroying the environment, we're also getting more in touch with we're getting closer to wild animals, which could enable direct human encroachment or direct human contact with diseases and infections. And of course, the resource exploitation is also causing this problem. And like I mentioned, agribusiness and industrial agriculture. Okay, so that I think kind of gives a summary of the first topic, which was focused on animal agriculture. And now I want to touch a little bit on deforestation from palm oil, because especially in this region in Southeast Asia, this is something that is very sensitive and very difficult, and a lot of people don't quite understand what's happening and what can we do, and is sustainable palm oil even possible? So I'm going to touch a little bit on this now. You may have heard before that palm oil is everywhere, and especially here we see it a lot, but globally palm oil is in about 50% of all products you can find in the supermarkets. And interestingly, Indonesia and Malaysia make up over 85% of the global supply chain for palm oil, meaning this is a really critical region for many, many products all around the world. At the same time, this is the biggest driver of deforestation in some of the most biodiverse forests and critical peatlands that exist in Southeast Asia. And it's also, of course, when peatlands are burned for palm oil plantations, it's very, very dangerous for threatening and critically endangering species. And just maybe I think probably most people know, but this burning of the land to create palm oil plantations is very standard practice, also because it's the quickest way to destroy and clear forest land to grow palm oil. And it's also a practice that's used, it's called slash and burn farming. And it's also a practice used to try to regenerate the soil to grow new palm oil plantations. And this is why it's continuous, and we've seen this problem for years and years. And this image here kind of helps to show a bit about the emissions, the critical aspect of peatlands and how the emissions are coming from Southeast Asia. This came from a study which doesn't look at every country, but the ones that are colored are the countries that were examined here. So even though Malaysia is not on there, you can see that Indonesia is, and we know that Malaysia is also a critical source of palm oil. And the circles on this map represent the emissions coming from the degradation of peatland. So you can see that even though the land space in Indonesia looks actually a little bit small compared to the other land coverage of peatland, the emissions coming from the burning of peatlands in Indonesia is the biggest source of emissions destruction, emissions from peatland destruction in the world. And I'm not sure if everybody also knows why is this happening? Why is peatland so important? Actually, peatland is it's a term to describe the composition of the soil underneath in a forest, and it's typically like wetlands. And that soil absorbs carbon, significantly more carbon than regular soil. So it's really important because actually the land underneath a peat forest can store up to 10 times the carbon of the forest above it. So when that land is destroyed, it has a much bigger impact than destroying other types of forests, which is why it's so important, because these forests are carbon sinks for us. And they are regions that desperately need to be protected if we want to avoid climate catastrophe. And that's why I think palm oil is such an important product to be looking at, because it's destroying some of the most important forests in the world. So like I mentioned, even though the land area is small, peatlands only cover 3% of land area, but they contain 42% of global soil carbon. So it's a really big impact when those are destroyed. And in Malaysia and Indonesia, the annual emissions from draining peatlands is equivalent to about 40 or 70 coal-fired power plants. So it's really, you can imagine this, we talk a lot about how bad fossil fuels are, but destroying these forests can be as bad as, the emissions from fossil fuel facilities. And I just wanted to show some examples of products that use palm oil, because we don't even always know, but it's very prevalent in products that we don't always think about. And one of the reasons, I mean, sometimes it's labeled in the ingredients as palm oil, but it's not always labeled that way. So one of the things that's really confusing is that there are so many alternate names for palm oil. You can see on the right side here, this is a list of alternative names that you might see in an ingredients list that are legally appropriate terms to mean palm oil in our ingredients list. So even when we are trying to, let's say, avoid using products that contain palm oil, it's really hard to identify which ones those are. And here I just wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of sustainable palm oil and what's really happening, because a lot of companies, big global companies, are using palm oil. All of these companies on the right listed, these brands are using palm oil in their products. And they have all committed to sourcing palm oil from no deforestation, no peat, and no exploitation. However, Greenpeace has been investigating for a long time, and the reality is that companies don't really know where their palm oil is coming from. They have not been able to assure at all that their palm oil is not coming from deforestation. And Wilmar is one of the world's largest palm oil traders. And even though they have committed to no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation, in 2018, Greenpeace found that Wilmar was still buying from 18 out of 25 groups that are deforesting for palm oil. So they're not even close to succeeding with this commitment that they claim. So we found that the certification for sustainable palm oil is really failing. And these companies absolutely need to be doing more to make sure they know their supply chains, and there needs to be more transparency and reduction of the sourcing from unsustainable or unknown palm oil sources that can't be traced. And you all might know, but I just wanted to highlight here the impact of this palm oil deforestation on our daily lives, because it's not just that it's bad for the environment in some parts of the world, but it's reaching other parts of the world that have nothing to do with it necessarily, or disproportionately affecting certain regions. So we know that KL looks like this on a normal day, but in 2019, when the haze came to KL, this is what it looked like. And of course, you can imagine the air pollution levels were very unhealthy, and it was not only disruptive for normal activities and travel and schools, but extremely bad for everybody's health. So this is the kind of thing that at Greenpeace we are really trying to prevent from happening. And during the pandemic, there was not so much haze because, well, kind of disrupted operations in many industries, but also weather patterns contribute to this. So the forces from El Nino were affecting kind of wind flows and movement. And that also was part of the reason why haze didn't show up as prominently in KL. But we don't know what it's going to be like this year, but we expect that it's possible haze could come back and it could turn into an annual thing again if we aren't doing something about it. And I also just wanted to mention who is kind of behind this, because there's also usually a lot of discussion blaming certain countries maybe, or certain companies, but the reality is that not only is it's a global issue, because the companies that are causing it, especially the haze that comes to Malaysia, well, even though that the palm oil concessions burning may be happening primarily in Indonesia, it's also happening a little bit in Malaysia, but the companies that own those palm oil concessions belong to Indonesian, Malaysian, and Singaporean companies primarily. And on top of that, global financial institutions are investing in this industry. So it's not something that we can only blame on Indonesia, for sure. I mean, there is a lot of financing and funding and operations coming from other countries that are investing in this industry. And in 2021, the world's top 50 financial institutions actually increased their investments in deforestation-linked industries, such as palm oil and beef. So the investment in these companies, even though globally we're talking a lot about climate change and companies are trying to promote sustainable investments and sustainable policies, we're often talking about carbon emissions, which is really, really important, but we don't talk so much about deforestation industries, and the investments in these industries are still increasing, which is very worrisome. And there were 5 Malaysian financial institutions that accounted for 1/5 of all of the investments in palm oil in the region. So it's something that we can demand change from every country almost in the world, because it's a supply chain that's really global. All right, so next I'm going to just jump into industrial fishing. And this is another one where I think a lot of people don't know much about where their fish comes from. And it might be surprising to learn the standard practices that are used to supply us with commercial fish. So there's a number of reasons why industrial fishing is harming us. The first one is that it's endangering species, because there's a lot of overfishing happening and it's very hard to protect marine protected areas. So 1/3 of fish populations have actually collapsed since 1950. And many fishing methods are really not good at fishing for only one kind of fish. They result in what's called bycatch, which is when they use nets, for example, that catch all kinds of animals in the ocean, And then they will often throw away the bycatch, which are the ones that they weren't intending to catch. And those animals are often killed and then dumped back into the ocean, which is just really horrible, wasteful, and terrible for the environment. And so hundreds of thousands of whales, dolphins, porpoises, and sharks are killed each year, often in the form of bycatch when different types of fish are intended to be caught. And this is not only bad for species, but it's destroying the entire ecosystems, because when you disrupt one population in the ocean, you can imagine, but it has a ripple effect. It affects the entire ecosystem in the ocean, and it's really creating imbalance in our ocean ecosystem. And it's also destroying livelihoods and threatening food security, because hundreds of millions of people live in coastal communities that are reliant on fishing for survival, people that are more disconnected from industrial food systems. And those people are the ones that are suffering most from this, because they are unable to catch fish to survive anymore, because fish are being overfished by commercial fishing. And it's really causing a lot of harm to communities that are not responsible. And the last one on here is that it's really harmful to humans as well, human workers, because modern slavery is a rampant problem in the fishing industry. And I'll go into that a little bit more. But the overall message here is it's really critical that we protect the ocean, because it's also one of the most important stores of carbon for us. And of course, just life in general is dependent on having the ocean alive. So if we kill the ocean, we will not survive. And this is something that I think people always imagine is not as important as it really is. We might not realize the significance of the ocean and what's happening to it, because it's hard to see. Usually the damage is being done very far away out in the high seas, and we think the ocean is so big, but our impact on it is much bigger than we think. And like I mentioned, modern slavery is something that's very common in the fishing industry, and Greenpeace, we do a lot of work on this, because most fishers on industrial fishing boats come from Southeast Asia. And we have many stories, and we support communities that are suffering because workers are exploited and taken onto fishing boats. And not only are they being abused, but they are often used to and forced to use illegal fishing practices. So you can imagine that the companies that don't care about human rights definitely don't care about the environment either, and they are not complying with any types of agreements or regulations to protect the ocean. And this is something that is really shocked me, because I didn't realize how bad this industry was and how much of our fish is coming from potentially modern slavery. And one of the reasons why this is so big in the fishing industry is a logistical reason, and that's because you can imagine when a boat goes out to sea, the fishers can't get off. Often their documents are taken. In many cases, they're trafficked, and they are held on these ships for much longer than they agreed to. In many cases, they sign a contract that suggests they'll be out at sea for maybe 3 months. And in some cases, they are held out at sea for 2 years or longer, which they have no choice about. And they also don't have access to their basic needs, may not be met. They don't have access to medical care. And especially with boats that are using illegal practices, they may not even have licenses to be in the waters that they're fishing. And so when a worker gets sick, they're not allowed to go to shore. And sometimes they die out at sea because they can't get access to basic medical care. And this is something that is just really horrific. And we at Greenpeace are trying to expose this as part of our work, because we're not only, Greenpeace is often known as just environmental protection, but it's a whole cycle, because the environment can't be protected if we're not respecting human rights and we're not demanding justice in all areas of the work that we do. And I wanted to just highlight here some of the fishing practices that are really destructive, because this actually surprised me when I first started learning about this. It's not just, overfishing doesn't just come from, line fishing a lot. It's not what they're doing out there. They use methods that are really, really destructive, such as bottom trawling, which is when giant nets are pulled across the sea floor, and that destroys whatever is in its path. So you can imagine this would destroy any kind of coral reef, any kind of life on the sea bottom, and it's extremely damaging for the ecosystem. And there's other examples like long lining, which is when thousands of hooks are baited along miles-long fishing lines, just catching as many fish as possible. And then again, these methods also produce bycatch, like I mentioned, which are fish that weren't intended to be caught, but end up dumped and killed. And of course, there's problems with overfishing and fishing in protected areas and fishing endangered species. All right, so moving on to this kind of last section, I want to talk about plastics issues and also maybe go into some examples of why plastics are so bad, and also how it links to our food, because it's something that is unfortunately become part of our food chain as well. So I'll start off by giving a few main reasons why plastics are so bad for us, which you might know some of these already, but you might not know exactly all of them, and some of it is really hidden by the industry. The first thing that I want to highlight is that plastic production is growing out of control. So this chart is showing the growth in global plastics production between 1950 and 2014. And it's exponentially growing. So it's really getting out of control. And it's something that is relatively new in the history of humanity. And we have never found a way to manage it. And it's having impacts on our health and the environment that have never been seen before in human history. And this is another reason why it's quite scary. The second reason the plastic is so bad is because over 99% of plastic is made from fossil fuels. So it's not just a pollution problem, but it's got its own carbon footprint, not only from the issue of waste management, but it's coming from oil. And if we keep using plastic at the current rate, by 2050, it's expected that plastic will be using 20% of our global oil consumption. It's also going to be using up a significant share of our carbon budget, which is the amount of carbon that we would have to limit ourselves to in order to stay within the global warming boundaries, the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming goal. And the third reason that plastics are so bad for us, and this links a lot to our food, is that microplastics are now in everything. You may have heard that microplastics are being found in water and food. It's now also been found in our air. We're breathing it. It's in our soil. It's in our blood. It's been identified in breast milk. It's been identified in human placenta. And so babies are actually being born with microplastics. And it's been found in very far to reach places such as the Arctic, showing that it's spread beyond our control. And this chart on the right shows some examples of the number of microplastics particles that have been found in certain consumables. It's not including all things, but just a select group of examples. You can see that bottled water has a very high number of microplastics compared to some other products. And that's not surprising, but a lot of people don't think about that when they are trying to reduce their use of bottled water. They think of it as a pollution problem, but it's also a health problem, because if you're drinking bottled water, you're drinking more plastic than if you drink tap water. It's also something that has been commonly found in in foods, including seafood, because fish are ingesting plastics, microplastics, and we're still eating fish, and that's entering our bodies. And the reason why it's so scary that we're eating microplastics is because plastic contains really dangerous chemicals, hormone disrupting chemicals, and forever chemicals that are really hard to remove from our body. And these enter our body through inhaling, ingesting, and also through our skin. And there are a number of issues that have been studied that we think are resulting from plastics exposure. But I think the even scarier thing is that this is a relatively recent thing, that we are eating so much food out of plastic containers, for example. This is something that didn't happen before the 1970s. It wasn't as common because plastics weren't really invented before the 1950s. So it's only in recent generations that we even have plastics, that we're exposed to plastic in our entire lives. And we're only seeing right now that babies are being born with plastic, and we don't even know what the impact, the long-term impact of that is. And we won't know until our children grow up. And it's also very hard to link health issues with plastic consumption because it's not immediate. But we know that it's causing problems. And I think for me, one of the scariest things that I have read about plastic chemicals exposure is the impact on fertility. So there have been a number of studies showing that our fertility rates are declining because of our exposure to chemicals in plastics. And in fact, in the past couple decades, the median sperm count in men has decreased by half. And it's possible that by 2045, the median sperm count could be 0 due to our ongoing consumption of products with microplastics and plastic chemicals. So it's really scary because for me, I think this is actually not only a pollution crisis, but it's a threat to our existence as well. And it's something that is impacting people in ways that we don't hear about very commonly in the media. And the fifth reason why plastic is so bad for us is, of course, the ecosystem destruction side, which you may have heard about. This one I think is quite common. And it's been estimated that by 2050, we will have more plastic in the ocean than fish by weight. And animals are dying everywhere in the ocean from ingesting plastic. And one of the really sad things I see is that animals think it looks like food. One of the, for example, turtles, they eat jellyfish. And when they see a plastic bag, it looks like a jellyfish. And so there are stories of turtles dying because they've been ingesting too many plastic bags. And it's really tragic. The final reason that I want to highlight here is that plastic pollution is very closely linked to social injustice. So we always talk about throwing away our trash, but we don't often think about what away means. And the reality is that there is no away, because there is nowhere that is safely and sustainably managing our waste. So often, this is an issue that is unjust globally, because we see a global plastic waste trade where often plastic waste is being shipped around the world from the richer, more developed countries to the more vulnerable, less developed countries that have lower regulations. And that's why it's very easy to ship plastic waste there. And this is happening. Southeast Asia is a region that's receiving a lot of plastic waste from the world. And this is a huge injustice because Southeast Asia and countries don't have the capacity to manage all of this waste, but also because even within countries, there's an injustice because typically the excess waste is dumped in areas where people are most vulnerable. It's often the lower income communities with less access to any kind of legal protection or education even about what's happening and how their health is being impacted by the dumping of waste and burning of it. So now moving on to this last section, I just want to quickly touch on why plastic recycling isn't something that's working for us entirely. Of course, recycling is important and we don't want to stop doing it, but I think the idea of recycling plastic is an idea that has been sold to us without really explaining the challenges and the limitations to it. And this is also because I just want to point out that the plastics industry is ultimately owned by the oil and gas industry, because like I mentioned before, 99% of plastics come from fossil fuels. So petrochemical companies are typically owned by oil and gas companies, and it's the same companies that have been lying about climate change and fossil fuels for decades. So they've also been kind of fooling us by saying plastics are fine because we can recycle them. The first reason why this is not true is because plastic recycling has never shown to work. The most recent data on recycling plastics show that only 9% of plastics were ever recycled globally as of 2015. But instead of being recycled, you may wonder what happens to it. And like I mentioned before, it's often exported globally, dumped on countries with less regulations. It gets dumped into landfills or the environment, where it often enters the ocean and our water. It also gets burned, which burning plastic is highly, highly dangerous. And people don't always realize how bad it is, but it's actually worse than burning fossil fuels because it produces poisonous gases because there's added chemicals in plastics. It's not even just burning a fossil fuel, it's burning a fossil fuel with added chemicals. And it also produces toxic ash. So this is something that I think everybody needs to know about, because sometimes people think it's okay to burn plastic along with their leaves, but it's extremely dangerous for the soil and for the air that we are breathing. The other reason why recycling is not working is because the actual term recycling is misleading. I won't go into too much detail of this chart, but the general idea is that most plastics, even when they are so-called recycled, are actually being downcycled into less quality materials. Studies have shown that only around 2% of plastics have been effectively recycled in the same quality material. And this is also because plastic is not infinitely recyclable. Most plastics can only be recycled at most once or twice before they have to be downcycled into a lower quality product. So while other materials like metal, glass, and even paper can be recycled over and over again into 100% recycled into the same quality material, this is not true for plastics. Also, money is a concern because plastics is a business, and it won't be recycled unless companies buy recycled plastic material to use for their products. But the problem is that recently, in 2019, new virgin plastic became cheaper than recycled plastic. So there was no incentive for companies to use even recycled plastic, making demand decrease significantly. And the price of virgin materials is linked to the price of oil because, of course, plastic comes from fossil fuel. So when the oil prices go down, so does the cost of new plastics. And the prices are really distorted. Obviously, they don't account for the environmental impact. But the cost of recycling plastic, on the other hand, has been increasing. And this is really problematic because it doesn't suggest that there's a future for recycling for us that's going to be able to really help our problem. The fourth reason that recycling is a problem is that there are so many different kinds of plastics and they cannot be recycled together. And often they need to be cleaned, sorted, and there's not usually facilities that can do this. In many countries in the world, only plastics number 1 and 2 can be legitimately labeled as recyclable because in most places, the facilities cannot recycle other numbers of plastics. And numbers 1 and 2 are usually beverage bottles and liquid bottles that contain liquids like shampoos or milk or laundry detergent. In Malaysia, we have an issue with the unknown, actually in many countries, this is a problem, not just Malaysia, but I wanted to talk a little bit about Malaysia here and also the US from my experience. But we aren't told what's actually recyclable. And we often see recycling containers that say that everything is collectible and recyclable, but the reality is that the facilities are not able to recycle a lot of the plastic material that is being thrown into the plastic bins, the recycling bins. And in 2021 in Malaysia, types 1, 2, and 5 were the most commonly recycled plastics, but I found that there's no comprehensive list of the types of plastics that are recycled in Malaysia. So it's actually really hard to know whether plastics are being recycled near you and which plastics are recyclable near you in the facility that's collecting your recycling. And just as an example, in the chart on the right, this one is in the US, but Greenpeace did a study to look at the acceptance rate of 4 common types of plastics in the US and found that they were very rarely able to be recycled. So things like plastic cups, plastic bags, plastic cutlery, and plates are accepted only between 1% and 11% of the time, which is not enough to be able to call those things recyclable. Also, we may not know it, but when plastic is contaminated with food, it can't be recycled. So it has to be clean. Otherwise, it contaminates the entire recycling batch. And in many cases, that means that the entire batch has to be thrown in the trash because it's often not economical to sort and clean all of the plastic. There's also a lot of types of packaging that we think and hope are recyclable, but they really aren't. Things like sachets, plastics that are covered with shrink sleeves, plastic that are mixed with other materials like our drink containers that are called Tetra Paks that look like paper on the outside, but it's lined with plastic and aluminum. Those aren't typically recyclable. They usually require special facilities because they have to be separated and it's not easy. And of course, food packaging bags are typically not recyclable. But people don't really know this because it's very hard to find out what's recyclable in your area, and the education on this is also not there. And the 6th reason that this plastic recycling is a problem is that there are inadequate facilities to manage the quantity of waste that we have. It's been really hard. It's really hard to find information in Malaysia on the actual recycling practices. But there was one report that claims that in Malaysia, it might only be possible to recycle 16% of domestic and imported waste, which is, of course, not remotely enough. And it makes us wonder, where is the rest of this recycling going, or where is the rest of our plastic waste going? And that's the problem, I think, is that it often ends up in our environment. And the other thing that's really interesting to note is there's a lot of discussion of the global plastic waste trade. And the reason why I think Malaysia likes to continue importing plastic waste from other countries is because it's easier for them to recycle. It often comes cleaner, sorted, and it's easier to process. And this means that it's preferred over domestic plastic waste in Malaysia. And so often the domestic household plastic in Malaysia is not being recycled because it's often contaminated, mixed with trash, and it's more difficult to sort. And the final reason that I want to put on here is that even though this is not always a problem of individuals, we are addicted to convenience, and we throw recyclable things into the trash. We contaminate our recycling with non-recyclable materials. We buy things that are not recyclable. Often we don't even know it, which is not necessarily our fault, but we buy a lot of things. And people sometimes actually throw away reusable materials instead of cleaning or reusing them because it's quicker. So we have this culture of being as fast as possible and making things as easy as possible that has really caused a lot of damage to the environment because we are not thinking of the impact of the products we consume. And so the conclusion here is that there's really no safe, feasible way to manage plastic. So we need to stop producing it, and we need to stop buying new plastic items. All right, just to quickly go through my last couple slides on solutions to leave you not too demoralized. I just want to highlight that, this is a systemic problem that is not just the responsibility of one group or one stakeholder. We need the government, businesses, and individuals to all be doing something about the climate crisis and the pollution crisis. We need people to be voting for politicians that care about climate change. We need much better policies. We also need businesses to stop lying about their practices. So we call this greenwashing, when they promote themselves as sustainable as a marketing tactic, but they're not actually doing meaningful change to become more environmentally conscious and safe. And we also, as individuals, we need to think about our consumption habits, and are we really reusing our products? Are we, buying new things that we don't need? It's something we have to be willing to bring our own water bottles and our own containers if we want refill and reuse systems to work. So just to give some ideas about what individuals can do, and also link to what my experience has been, I think shopping zero waste, especially saying no to plastic, especially when you're eating food and drinks. Do not eat out of plastic because it increases your risk of ingesting microplastics. Buying local, eating more plant-based foods, growing your own food, composting, repairing, reusing, and repurposing, and thinking about whether we need what we're buying. We have this culture where we just want to buy new things because it's nice and it gives us a short-term good feeling, but it's really harming the environment. So I just wanted to share, finally, my final slide is just with some inspiration to show. I know Kapeng mentioned that I practice zero waste, and I wanted to show a little bit how I do that. So you can see here that this is how I buy products, and I store them in primarily glass jars and Tupperware. And I go to zero waste bulk stores, which exist in KL, in Malaysia, and in most countries, most big cities. There are options, and we just don't really hear about them, but you can find places where you can reduce your consumption of plastics and processed food and harmful food. So that's all, and I will close here and open for any questions if there are some. I'm not sure if there's time though.